This is quite possibly the strangest story I have to tell, and it just happens to be incredibly scary as well. Well, at least to me it was. Every year, my wife and I would go camping in new and interesting places. Part of the thrill for us was finding places that we'd never been before. There are so many places in this world to stay, and we wanted to experience as much as we could. Some places are great, and some places were rough. But none of the places were nearly as bad as this horrible campsite that we visited in Vermont. When we go camping, we like to stay in the wilderness and be as secluded as much as possible. For this trip, we were going to stay in a cabin instead of sleeping in a tent. We found an awesome place that seemed to be in the middle of nowhere. However, when we got there, we were surprised to see that there was a house directly next door to the cabin that was probably only 20 feet away. We weren't thrilled about this discovery, since this left our privacy to a minimum, but we tried to ignore it and make the best of the situation. For the first day, we didn't see or hear anybody, and we felt a wave of relief. We thought that maybe the house was vacant, and we worried for nothing. This relief soon faded away when we actually had a face-to-face encounter with a neighbor the next day. It was a woman. I guess she'd be in her late 40s, and she had a daughter whom she mentioned was 15 years old. The woman was nice, and the young daughter was polite and respectful, and she introduced herself. The woman was some sort of author, and she said that she and her daughter would move up here every summer so they could concentrate and not be distracted by the city. It was a short but ultimately pleasant conversation. Even though we weren't thrilled about the neighbors, at least they seemed like nice people, and I didn't think I was going to have any issues, which was mostly true for a couple of days. On the fourth day, I was sitting on the back deck, which overlooked an endless sea of trees. My wife was in a cushioned lounge chair, fast asleep. I was reading my book when I heard a distracting noise. It started faint, but once I heard it, it was all I could hear and focus on. It was this squeaky and spring-filled sound. I looked to my right, and just barely in view was the corner of the neighbor's backyard. What I saw was the teenage girl, and she was bouncing on the trampoline. What I observed was kind of weird, though. The girl was just skipping around in a circle on the trampoline. Now, on its own, that's fine and not weird at all. But what was weird was how fast she was moving in a circle, and the fact that she was having a full-blown conversation with no one. Not to sound creepy, and I know it's hard not to, but I observed this girl for a while, and her speed never slowed down as she whipped around in a circle, and the conversation never stopped. That night I was telling my wife about it, and she just said that I'm weird and there could be a million different reasons why she was acting the way that she was. She told me that sometimes teenage girls get excited, and maybe that she had talked to a boy online, or maybe she just had a very vivid imagination. My wife said that, after all, it probably gets boring being up here in the woods all summer long, basically being quiet so her mother could write. My wife made a lot of great points, and I soon forgot about it and went to sleep. That night, I woke up a little after 3 in the morning and went to grab a glass of water from the kitchen. I was standing over the sink drinking the water, and I just happened to be staring out of the windows above the sink. The window was a clear shot to the neighbor's house, and while I was looking out of the window, I almost broke the glass in my hand in terror. Standing on the other side of the windows of the neighbor's house was the daughter, and she was just looking at me with the most disturbing look I had ever seen. I felt every hair on the back of my neck stand up, and I immediately walked away. Maybe 2 minutes later, I went over to a different window that still faced the house, and she was still looking out of her window. But she was still looking at me, even though I was in a different window. I was incredibly freaked out, and I just closed the blinds and went back to bed. I didn't really sleep that night, and I just tried to justify the behavior any way that I could. In the morning, I told my wife about what happened the night prior over breakfast, and she did admit that it was a little weird, but again told me it was nothing to worry about. That afternoon, after a day of hiking, we were sitting on the back porch again. I tried to get into my book, and that's when I heard the bouncing again. I looked over, and there was the girl again, skipping around in a circle and talking, but talking to no one. I pointed it out to my wife, and now that she could see just how fast she was going, and the body language, even my wife admitted that it was a little strange. Thankfully, my wife had just witnessed the same thing I did just moments later, because if she didn't see it either, I may not have believed what I saw with my own eyes. While she was bouncing around, it was like she suddenly hit a wall. We could hear her grunt in the way her body contorted. It was literally as if she hit an invisible wall. Then, in a voice that sounded like fear, she said, "I'm so sorry." She put her head down, bounced very softly and slowly for a few seconds, and then turned around and went inside. We were freaked out. If she was just bouncing around, talking to herself, that would be one thing, but whatever just happened moments ago was one of the most unsettling things I'd ever seen and heard. That night, my wife and I stayed up late and played some card games. Around 1 a.m, we were getting ready for bed, and out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the girl staring at me from one of her windows. I grabbed my wife so she could see, and she confirmed that the girl's expression was haunting. Then the girl did something that freaked us both out. She turned to her side and started to talk to someone or something, and then she pointed right at us. We both got goosebumps. What the heck was going on? We both were on high alert all night. There was very little sleep going on, as we heard strange noises all night long that we didn't hear the entire week up to this point. Once the sun rose, we felt some comfort that all of the strange activity would be over. This was supposed to be our last day, and rather than stay until 11 o'clock, we started loading up the car around 8 a.m. We were ready to leave by 9, and we decided to have one last cup of coffee on the deck before we hit the road. While we were drinking our coffee, we'd heard the sound of the trampoline one last time. We looked over, and there was the girl, again going around in a circle and chatting with nothing. If this wasn't haunting enough on its own, it was about to get worse. All of a sudden, the girl stopped on a dime. It was like time was frozen. She slowly turned to stare right at us. We were beyond freaked out, and we didn't look away. The smiles from her invisible chat moments ago were gone, and she was looking at us with these hateful eyes. She pointed to us again, and just like she did the night prior. And then we heard it. From seemingly nowhere, we heard the low, guttural sound of a growl. The teenage girl giggled and said in a cheerful voice, "Yep, that's them." We could hear the low, growling noise again as the girl started to laugh uncontrollably. We didn't wait for another second. We ran to the car and drove as fast as we could. We didn't look back, and we never followed up with the cabin owner if anyone else had ever complained. Trust me when I tell you, I know how unplausible all of this sounds. I'm sure there's a logical explanation, but I still haven't figured out what it is all of these years later. Maybe someone reading this knows what we encountered that day. Maybe it was just a young woman who had a powerful imagination. The only issue with that is, it doesn't explain the growl and the loud thud of the girl hitting a wall. The only thing I do know, whenever I go camping now, I make sure that my wife and I are completely alone. And I just hope I never encounter anything even remotely as strange as this again. This story, I realize, may sound unbelievable to most, but I know what I saw that evening, and I plan on getting the word out to anybody who will listen. Maybe, just maybe, somebody out there will believe my story. Several years ago, I accompanied my friend Joe on a hiking and camping experience through the desert. Joe is not his real name, but I'm going to call him that in order to protect his identity. Joe is an aspiring filmmaker, and he used to like camping trips to help him come up with ideas. This trip started out the same as most of the trips that he and I used to take. We just kept going, even in the darkness. For us, Part of the thrill was just being one with nature. If we got lost, going into new, small towns was always part of the adventure for us. We were wandering in the middle of seemingly nowhere in the Nevada desert, when shortly after midnight, we noticed a bunch of lights on the horizon. Confused at what this could possibly be, we decided to investigate. We approached a small cliff and looked over the edge. There were dozens and dozens of military vehicles in a convoy. Now, the weird thing about this was there were no roads. This was literally in the middle of nowhere, USA. We joked that they were probably going to Area 51 or some other secret base, but again, that was just a joke until what we saw next. The convoy of Hummer-like vehicles was followed by a huge truck that was pulling something huge. Something I can only describe as something you would see in a science fiction movie. It was a huge silver disc. The first thing that came to my mind was a flying saucer, and trust me, I know how that sounds. It was probably the size of a yacht, maybe 30 feet in length, maybe bigger. It was perfectly spherical in diameter, at least from what I could tell. And what made me jump right to saucer or satellite or something like that was the fact that we could make out some sort of small cockpit-like structure on the top of the disc. The disc also appeared to be buried because as it followed the military vehicles, there was a layer of dust that was coming off of the disc. And we both looked at each other and were at a loss for words. This was something that normal people were clearly not supposed to see. We tried to be skeptical about the entire situation, but it was just too obvious. It took 2 more days for us to get out of the desert after that. We were paranoid that the military was going to find us and arrest us, or even worse. After the incident, Joe decided to keep quiet, but I wanted the world to know what we saw. Most people just laugh and snicker when I tell them, and they call me a UFO conspiracy theorist. But some people do believe me. I hope by sharing my story, others will come forward if they have seen similar things. There are things in this world that we don't know, and we can only discover them by sharing our experiences. I ain't no writer, but I'll tell you what happened the best I can. It was me and my buddies Aaron and Joel. We'd been pals since grade school, and our tradition was to head up to the woods every summer for a few days of camping. The wilderness was our playground, a time to unplug from all the crap of our daily lives. This one summer, though, our trip took a very strange turn. So, there we were, up in the sticks. We'd been hiking all day, so we were pretty wiped out when we finally set up camp. There was this strange chill in the air, kind of like the AC was on full blast, but we were outside, and it was mid-July. When we'd just finished eating our canned beans, we're sitting around the fire, joking and catching up on life, when we heard it. A rustle in the bushes nearby. And not the squirrel-type rustle or even a deer rustle. This was a loud and deliberate sound. And Joel's a big guy, 6'4" and all muscle, and he's also the most cautious one of all of us. So he picked up a thick branch lying nearby. We decided to go check out what was making the noise. We crept towards the source of the sound, the firelight flickering against our backs, barely illuminating the path ahead. As we got closer, the noise stopped. When it happened, we were standing near the big old oak tree, scanning the underbush. It wasn't a sound or a movement, but a feeling. Like a charge in the air, you know? Static electricity, but heavier. Then, there it was. Just past that oak tree, a figure, all white and glowing, like moonlight on the snow. It didn't have a clear shape, it was more like a fog or a cloud of light, but it was definitely there. It didn't look at us because whatever it was, it didn't have eyes, but it did feel like it was looking right at us. We froze. Even Joel, tough as nails, was as still as the night around us. It hovered for a moment, long enough to burn the image into our minds. And then as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Vanished, just like that. We stood there in silence for a long moment, with our hearts pounding in our chests. None of us could explain it. We still can't. We've talked about it a lot, replayed the scene over and over, trying to make sense of it, but we just can't explain it. We saw something that night, something unexplainable. It's not a bear, a burglar, or some lost camper that we saw. No, it was something else, something beyond us. There's a part of us that wants to go back and see if we encounter that apparition again, but there's another part that's just too scared, and we know some things are just best left alone. I ain't a believer in ghosts. Well, not really. But I did see something that night. We all did. And it changed us, somehow. It made the world a bit more mysterious, a bit more terrifying. But like I said, I ain't a writer, but this is what happened. You can believe it, or you don't have to. But I know that sometimes the world isn't as simple as we'd like to think.